Well, welcome everybody to the Water Issues Talk. Today we are going to hear from Lee Engel with the MPCA. He's been at the MPCA for 16 years now in the Water Quality Monitoring Program. Today he's going to talk to us about the low flow conditions in the Minnesota River during the summer of 2021 and some of the data that was collected and help us better understand all of these connections between low flow dissolved oxygen and total phosphorus. So I won't get into too much detail. We'll just get going and have Lee present his data and all of his great information to share with all of us today. So thanks for being here with us, Lee, today. We always appreciate everyone's time presenting and sharing their work with us. So I will go ahead and let you take over.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Brooke. Yeah, so today I'm going to go over the Minnesota River and the low flow monitoring that we conducted this past field season. In some regards, this information is brand new. It's been a long study throughout history, but what I mean by brand new is we're just getting some of the finalized data within the past week or so. So I'll preview some of those analyses later, but know that this is still a little bit in the works as a project overall. Okay, so I kind of want to start with the setting of the Minnesota River. As many of you know, this is one of the 5 large rivers that we consider, large rivers in Minnesota. The river originates on the South Dakota-Minnesota border over by Ortonville. Many might know Big Stone Lake. It's a long, 20-some mile lake right on the border, and that's where the Minnesota River begins. From there, it flows southeast down towards Redwood Falls and Mankato. It's approximately 335 miles in total length. And it has, you can see, a very large drainage area, a large portion of southwest Minnesota, approximately 16,000, 800 square mile drainage covering 10 million acres. Also, there's 13 major watersheds, which a lot of us that work in water quality know, you break up the state into 80 watersheds based on the hydrology. So 13 of those, are contributing directly or through their flow networks to the Minnesota River. The drainage area covers approximately 37 counties from its headwaters to where it ultimately terminates at the Mississippi River confluence. So for this study, we're talking about the lower 22 miles of the Minnesota River. And that's roughly from around Shakopee, Valley Fair, if you're looking for a landmark, to, like I said, the confluence with the Mississippi River. The Minnesota River is broken up, and other rivers and streams throughout our state are broken up into different segments. Those segments are broken up based on hydrology for the most part, or entering into municipalities or other jurisdictional areas like county borders, city borders, such as that. So for this study, we did have 7 sites in this lower 22-mile reach, and these are historic sites that have been monitored many times, large data sets, but unique conditions kind of dictate the work that we did, and I'll get into that. So I think it's important too to kind of set the stage of, why, what's going on with this? These large rivers, there's so many issues around them. You hear low flow study, you hear dissolved oxygen, you hear total phosphorus, contributions from the watersheds, contributions from wastewater treatment facilities, and it's all trying to be wrapped up into one problem, right? And like most things in the scientific world, nothing's ever that clear. So to kind of start, from the lens I've been looking at things, because my unit and the water quality monitoring section in general, a bulk of their work revolves around condition assessments. So assessing a lake or a river or a stream for its ability to support aquatic life, aquatic recreation, aquatic consumption, drinking water, different use classes such as that. So for this one, we're looking at the aquatic life use in the Minnesota River. And to kind of set some context for the Minnesota River in its entirety, I pulled up kind of the lengths of river or areas of the river that have impairments for aquatic life use, meaning it's, not supporting fish and invertebrates and other critters that live in the river as a good habitat for them. So we see turbidity or total suspended solids impairments from Lac La Parle Dam, which is south of Big Stone Lake, all the way through the river to the Mississippi River, so most of the Minnesota River. We see excess nutrients or eutrophication, which is the river eutrophication standard from Granite Falls to the Mississippi River. And then likewise, the biota signature, we see impairments for macroinvertebrates, being the bugs that reside in the river from Big Stone Lake to Beaver Creek. I know that's not a good landmark, but basically a section of the river that has that issue. And then you see that the dissolved oxygen impairment is on this lower section of the river, the section we're talking about today, River Mile 22 to the Mississippi River. And these all kind of play into each other because a dissolved oxygen impairment is, that's the parameter it's impaired for, but it's an aquatic life use impairment, meaning that that habitat for that biota isn't suitable at certain times. So there was a lot of material available from previous presentations, previous studies that speak to, the issue that we're talking about with dissolved oxygen and low flow. There's been multiple data collection efforts specifically when the river has been low. So 1980, 1988, and that one I called out uniquely because the flow was so low, it was at the 7Q10, and I'll get into that a little later, but that's the average concentration or average flow for 7 days, 7-day average in a 10-year period. Very low flow. 1992, the river was formally listed. This reach, this 22-mile section, was formally listed for low dissolved oxygen during low flow conditions. And in 2004, the EPA approved the Minnesota River low flow TMDL. More recently, so prior to 2021, the last time a low flow data collection effort was done was in 2012. So you can see, it's roughly every 10 to 15 years that conditions are low flow and allowed to go collect data. So it's a unique situation, and when that occurs, we want to make sure we get out there and get new data. I will say too, low flow is a generic term, right? There's a whole spectrum of flow. So 1 year's low flow, unless you put it into like a statistical bucket and kind of qualified what it actually is, may or may not allow for years to be compared when we went out and did the quote unquote low flow study. So to go over the site specific standards, so what the data is being compared to see if the Minnesota River for this segment is meeting the aquatic life use, reads as such. The average daily 5 milligram per liter needs to meet 50% of the time when the flow rate is at summer 7Q10, which is, an actual flow rate. And then, like I said, 7Q10 is defined as the 7-day flow within a 10-year recurrence interval. For the benchmark to look at this, the flow rates in the TMDL are tied to the flow at Jordan. And Jordan, Minnesota is roughly around river mile 40, so it's upstream of this 22 miles section, but that's where the USGS gauge is. That's where there's a very large historic data set for discharge and flow and velocity and other parameters revolving around the river passing through that point. So here I just want to point out that when we're talking about that spectrum of low flow, the 7Q10 low flow at Jordan is 298 CFS, cubic feet per second. I'll talk about this a little later, but the lowest flow we observed in 2021 was like 540 something. So it's low, but it still hasn't approached or reached that 7Q10 low benchmark. So what did we sample? When we go do the low flow study, it's a pretty, I don't know if I'd say generic, but it's a standard suite of water chemistry parameters that we typically collect on all of our large rivers. You can see that it kind of spans the nutrients along with hardness, your productivity, and your chlorophyll and phaeophytin, and along with your nutrients being, your phosphorus and nitrate, nitrite, or nitrogen species. Water chemistry parameters, yes, I have a typo here. That I meant to have the SON measurements under the water chemistry parameters, which would be your dissolved oxygen, your temperature, your conductivity, and your pH. So those are the physical measurements that we're taking with a water quality sonde that you can see in the picture, which is instrumentation that's deployed in the river. And also we use a separate sonde to do a spot check for calibration purposes. So how we deployed this equipment, it's not flashy, right? Like we went out with buoys, chains, cinder blocks, pipe straps, and name of the game was put enough weight on the bottom, suspend a chain or a rope that's not going to break due to wave activities or barge traffic coming down the river, and enough flotation that it doesn't sink, say if water levels were to come up quickly, and you could still find it. So we literally strapped cinder blocks together, deployed them at the 7 locations that the study had historically been done at. We used carabiners to hook the sonde instrumentation at the halfway point or depth of the river channel where we're at, and then we let them sit. We would come back weekly to do a spot check and water chemistry visits. So that's when we actually physically grab water samples and then take a sonde measurement reading, where we'd have to lower the second sonde down to the depth of the deployed sonde on the chain. And we're looking to see, do the numbers match, right? Is the deployed sonde giving us good data? Is it staying within calibration? And one kind of side note that was interesting is we had to track down who do you need to inform that we're, deploying this instrumentation and these buoys in the river. People that are out in the field quite a bit know that people are curious in general, and if they see a buoy floating in the river, a lot of times they may choose to drive up and pull it up to see what it is or drag it up on shore. Or in this case, it could be a real navigation hazard because we were putting these on the edge of the main channel in the Minnesota River. And like I said, for the first about 15 miles or so, there is barge traffic regularly moving through there, and that can displace a lot of water, and we don't want our equipment getting run over because, one, we lose data, and two, the equipment's fairly expensive. So what we get from a a sonde, so a continuous data set. These sondes were set to take a measurement about every 15 seconds, 24 hours a day for the duration of the deployment. So there's a lot of data processing and, calibration that needs to go into effect to kind of finalize these continuous data sets. So here you can see the dissolved oxygen concentration in milligrams per liter is the red line, and it's fluctuating by day. You get a diurnal DO flux. It's fluctuating due to temperature of the water, due to the flow rate or the velocity of the water coming down the river. And then the blue dots are our spot checks, and that's where we went and deployed that secondary sonde to check to see if they matched. And then there's protocol for storing all of these in the whiskey database is what it's called, to basically confirm that you did have a valid continuous data set that meets, its kind of rigorous review. And I will say we did have some hiccups. We had one sonde that one of the wipers stopped working and it started to deviate from the spot checks. In that case, we were able to do a calibration correction to save some of the data set. And we did have one sonde that simply malfunctioned partway through, batteries or some sort of, I don't know if it was batteries because it was still on when we picked it up, but it stopped logging partway through. But that's kind of the name of the game with field work, is that you put things in an extreme environment. They work most of the time, but rarely 100%. So what did we get from the study overall, the 7 sondes deployed? This graphic shows the solid red line as the water quality standard, the 5 milligrams per liter. The solid blue line is the flow rate coming down the river as monitored at the gauge. All of the dotted lines are the individual sondes, the 7 that we deployed, and you can see that 4 of them dip below the red line, meaning that dissolved oxygen was less than 5, which is the standard we're comparing it to. You can also see the river miles depicted for each one of the lines. The river miles are important because the river changes as you move downstream. The first 15 miles are maintained for navigation, therefore they're actively dredged. The river channel is much deeper, 15 to 30 feet probably on average. Upstream of there, where it's not maintained, the river's kind of a different from a channel depth perspective, anywhere from 3 to 5 feet. Now there's, holes on outside bends and deeper areas, but on average, it's much shallower up there. And you can also see that the further you go down the river, in some regards, the less dissolved oxygen there was. So, the lowest, the 4 that exceed are the lower 4 locations out of the 22 miles. So how do you explain this? Why are we seeing exceedances? Why did it go below 5 milligrams per liter? Why do we suspect that? And I've had some conversations with effluent staff, and they've kind of shed some light onto what's going on. And it ties back to nutrients in the river. And, I talked about the impairment for river eutrophication, excess nutrients. In general, nutrients are going to grow chlorophyll, right? You have elevated nutrients, you grow more chlorophyll. If you have warm conditions, low flow, a lot of sunlight, you grow even more chlorophyll. And that chlorophyll is floating, right? So it's making its way down the river slowly. Well, in the reaches further upstream from that dredged area, the lower 15 miles, you have a good habitat, being, and everything algae needs to grow readily. And we saw that. And when that algae then enters the deeper channel, it has a harder time during low flow. It doesn't stay in suspension. It starts to settle out, die, and decay. And when algae's dying, it goes through decomposition, just like any organic substance, and it pulls oxygen out of the water column because it's being used up to decompose. So what you start to see is as you go further down in those deeper sections and flows slow down, you get more and more dying or dead algae pulling dissolved oxygen out of the water column. And that's what's going to affect and make aquatic life tough to obtain for fish and invertebrates that live there. So you're kind of making a stressful situation even worse, right? You already have very warm water temperatures, very low flow, and now you're adding low dissolved oxygen on top of it. So it can be tough for a fish or a bug to reside in that portion of the river during those times. For comparison's sake, the general thought is, can you go back and look at each one of these points in time that we had low flow conditions and compare them to each other? And I'd kind of caution against that in some regards because they are low flow conditions, but they're not the same. Just coincidentally, the 2012 and 2021 studies, the deployments were almost the same, August 3rd to the August 25th, 26th. That was just happenstance based on when crews got out there and the flows that we were seeing when we were watching the gauges. In 2012, the sondes were deployed when the river was flowing at 1200 CFS, and the lowest flow rate that was observed during that deployment time was 842 CFS. Whereas in 2021, the sondes were deployed at 800 CFS, so already lower than the lowest observed in 2012, and flows went down to as low as 538 CFS. So much lower than 2012, but not as low as the 7Q10 flow rates that were seen in the 88. And I guess this is just, I took the hydrographs from the river at Jordan for the 2012. So the left hydrograph, you can see the date is 2012, and then you can see the one on the right is 2021. And you can just see the difference in flow pattern, right? And this just kind of reiterates that the lowest flow we saw was 800 something CFS in 2012, whereas in 2021 it did actually was much lower for the duration of the deployment. And then you can see the triangles, right? So that's the median daily statistic based on 86 years of data for what the flow is under that condition. So you're talking, 1700 to 2000 CFS most years. So if we're talking 500 in 2021, it kind of puts in context how low the flow really is at these stations. These points were taken from working with communication staff. Some of you may saw that there was a media release when we were doing the study, just based on the fact that there were drought conditions in 2021, low flow sampling was going on, and we were getting an opportunity to go collect this data for the first time since 2012. The test at that time is, what can we find out about, are we making progress based on the TMDL? And there's two portions, in general that people are thinking of: non-point or contributions from the basin, and then, the direct wastewater treatment facilities that are discharging. And that ratio changes based on flow, how much water is discharged, how much water is coming down the river. But this gives a little bit of context to some of the progress or some of the investments that have been made to address the wastewater treatment portion of it. So in 2004, in the TMDL, it was identified that there's total phosphorus waste load allocations for 40 of the largest continuous discharging wastewater treatment plants upstream of Jordan. Since then, 2 of them are no longer in operation or discharging. There's now 146 wastewater treatment facilities with effluent limits in the basin. And then there's the 2 Met Council wastewater treatment facilities that are discharging directly into this lower 22-mile section that we're looking at. And there's some more information that was provided in that press release at the link in this presentation. Also identified in there were reducing phosphorus and wastewater strategies, and those included stabilization ponds, not discharging during those summer months when you could experience low flow and warmer water temperatures. 18 unsewered communities now have wastewater treatment systems, and then improved phosphorus removal for wastewater treatment surpassed the permitted goals for wastewater phosphorus loading to the basin ahead of schedule. So we know it's hard to quantify, right, the mix of wastewater treatment contributions and the basin contributions. Obviously, they're teased out, and we have a unit that's dedicated to looking into that. So I'm not going to go into more detail on those aspects. Basic conclusions, and this is just based on conversations I've had with, the effluent group and watershed division staff and my own staff. Clearly in 2021, we can still tell that phosphorus contributions from the Minnesota River Basin are an issue. And the issue that I'm getting at here is that we saw the exceedance in the river eutrophication standard in the data that was collected, and that portion of the river is listed upstream of this 22-mile reach for river eutrophication. And that phosphorus, like I said, is fueling the algae, and the algae dying and decomposing is having effects on the dissolved oxygen. So they're all intertwined together, but they're all affecting aquatic life. In 2021, just quite simply, that was one of the things we wanted to know is, did dissolved oxygen ever dip below that 5 milligrams per liter for any amount of time? And we did see that at those 4 lower SOND locations, as I showed in the graphic earlier. So yes, we did see exceedances. Just acknowledging that growing conditions, velocity, river channel depth, habitat for algae are all affecting dissolved oxygen levels. So it's a complicated situation. There's some hypotheses out there that are still being looked at that, if you have sunny days and good habitat and you're growing a lot of algae, which release oxygen into the water, the river probably does all right. If you get prolonged shady overcast conditions and you're not getting a lot of algae growth, you may see a bigger swing in oxygen, and you may see more decomposition happening at those times, and lower or sub 5 milligram per liter concentrations for a duration of, who knows how long, a week or a few days. And then just the main point, like, low dissolved oxygen during low flow warm conditions is stressful on biota, which is what the impairment is, addressing through the aquatic life piece. I just kind of want to acknowledge that this was kind of a big coordination effort in general. You kind of always see that you know, this work can pop up at any time. So the field crews in my unit were doing their normal work, and we kind of got to ask, can you go do dissolved oxygen on the Minnesota River? We had some challenges in getting sondes ready to go because the parts we ordered for them pre-season, were delayed with supply chain issues by months, and we actually got them right while we were deploying and were able to go swap them out. Communications, came out on the boat with us, documented the situation, put together, the press release, did their homework on what the condition was. So it was enjoyable to work with them. Speaking with Watershed Division leadership on, the condition in general, the history behind it, what's going on in the basin, kind of getting the overall picture, and then ultimately the effluent limit unit, who's interested in the data and synthesizing the results kind of as we speak and coming up with these finer conclusions of understanding, the phosphorus, chlorophyll, low dissolved oxygen interactions for this portion of river specifically. And that's all I have for today. I'd be happy to answer questions. I know we have people on this call that have been working with the data as well and may be able to speak to questions as well. So I'll just open up the floor for questions.
All right, you guys can feel free to unmute yourself if you want to just go ahead and ask your question, or I don't know if you can see the chat, Lee, or if you're still in presentation mode.
Okay.
But I will go ahead. We have one, or well, there was two. Marco asked about the DO being below 5 milligrams per liter, but Dennis had answered that yes, it was below the standard as a daily average around August 8th. And now we've got a question from Scott. But since 1988, there's been a significant reduction in phosphorus loading from wastewater treatment plants due to phosphorus water quality standards. Is there any evidence that all that phosphorus reduction has helped water quality in the Minnesota River?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that one's probably a tough one to answer. I don't know about the wastewater contributions. I do know that part of our large river study is the Minnesota River as a whole, right? The entirety of the river. We did see, exceedances or the river eutrophication standard being exceeded for a long portion of the river. So I think it gets at what the source of phosphorus is, and that, clearly there's excess phosphorus in the river upstream of where a large number of these wastewater treatment facilities are coming in. So alluding to that there needs to probably be some work in the basin, and I know that work's, going on, but how long will it take to see results, I guess, is the question.
All right, great. Looks like we've got another question in the chat from Robert. Are the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport discharges being included in the study? DO, phosphorus?
I mean, I would have to look at a map to see exactly where they are now. The sites were located, right, to capture that 22-mile reach, because that is, the reach or the bounds of what we're working with for this impairment. So depending on where those come in, and I guess I'm not familiar enough with the location to speak to that if they're upstream or downstream, but essentially with all the sites, anything coming down the river is going to be picked up, but whether you can discern a direct contribution from any specific one would be a question that I don't have the answer to.
I could answer some of this is Dennis. I could answer some of the questions.
Sure.
I mean, what we saw with the airport first is we had low DO upstream of that, if that's at river 3.5. in reality, even Blue Lake and Seneca, we're adding a fair amount of phosphorus from Jordan, which is at river mile 39. But when we move into that simple graphic that Lee had, where we move into that deeper segment, phosphorus doesn't matter anymore because light limitation takes over. So so we're adding phosphorus, but it doesn't matter because light, you go from a 3 to 5 foot deep river to 11 to 12-foot deep river, and it's just too deep to really grow the algae that they're at. So it's a problem. All those phosphorus sources matter to Lake Pepin, so they have limits for Lake Pepin. But that's why the original low DO TMDL was much more concerned about dischargers like Mankato or St. Peter that would be driving the algae the upstream. And the question on whether or not it's made a difference, what I can tell you with Ida Mendez and I looking at the data, at Jordan, we're starting to see that during low flow, that orthophosphorus is very low. So we know that we're getting very close to making reductions. If orthophosphorus disappears, that means that there's no available phosphorus. It's all in the algal cells, where like in the old pre-phosphorus reduction from wastewater plants at wastewater, there was a orthophosphorus available. So we talk about that being the knee of the curve. We're just at the edge of really starting to reduce algae. But the Minnesota River is a very complex basin. When we have 12 Huck 8s contributing to it, we think of low flow as only point source reductions in a simplistic way. But in reality, there's isolated thunderstorms throughout the Minnesota River Basin all the time. So you get little pulses of a non-point coming in. Let's say the Redwood River gets a thunderstorm. We get a little non-point phosphorus coming in, even though all the point sources have been reduced. So comparing all these different flows is kind of difficult, but I'm kind of getting into a lot of detail, but those are just a couple of points.
I can speak to the question regarding the SONs. So a 1-month deployment is not a long deployment for the water quality SONs that we're using. So they all had fresh batteries at the beginning. The air, I shouldn't have said the battery died on the one SON. It was more the SON malfunctioned, whether it was a power to the actual probes or, bad batteries, which likely wasn't the case. The SONs were calibrated right before they were deployed per the manufacturer's specs and as required through our standard operating procedures for storing the data in our whiskey database. We did have older DO probes in the SONs to start. Like I said, our shipment that we had ordered in like May finally came in August, and we went out the second week of the deployment and put all brand new dissolved oxygen probes and sensors in the SONs. So those were all fresh and brand new, and we didn't see any deviations based on the output and the spot checks. We did go, like I said, weekly for the month of the deployment. So we actually had the day we deployed, we took water chemistry and a spot shot, and then we visited for the next 4 consecutive weeks while the SONs were deployed, taking the spot shots at each location and water chemistry. And I will say, when we put the deployments into whiskey and ran it against the QA/QC checks, that all of the deployments came out in like a very good, I guess, quantification of precision. One we did have to do a correction on due to a wiper malfunction, but the other ones worked as they should have.
Right, and it looks like we've got a question here from Marco. I'm not sure if Dennis or Lee, one of you want to take this question about if the older low flow studies find DO impairments in the segments that are no longer dredged. upstream of River Mile 15.
Hello, this is Aida. And Marco, I guess that the studies prior to 1980 did show that from River Mile 22, which was dredged at that time, to River Mile 15, there was low DO. And that is no longer the case.
Thank you, Ida. Are there any more questions or comments for Lee?
There is a question here about the surface temperatures and DO concentrations at different depths. Lee, do you have anything to say about that with respect to this study?
Oh, okay, let me see here. I don't know that we did that comparison. It was prescribed to us. I know in reading about some of the previous studies, there was SANS deployed in like the photic zone or like the top 1.5 feet and at the midway depth of the channel. When we went out, we were just looking for that comparison and documenting for consistency purposes that mid depth of the channel. So we did take measurements at the surface. I don't know that I compared them or anyone compared those to the deployed depth because that's what, the study called for. So I guess one could go back. I would suspect that, dissolved oxygen concentrations would be higher at the surface clearly than the mid depth of the channel.
And this is Ida. So from previous studies, it has been shown that the lower 15 miles of the Minnesota River are kind of, in general, completely mixed, so that there is not that much difference between temperature within the column, the water column, and neither DO, dissolved oxygen.
So this is Scott Kaiser. I have one more question. This is probably, I think I already know the answer to it, but the Minnesota River didn't even get to the 7Q10 flow rate. It was close. It hovered near there, but it wasn't below that value for a full 7 days like you would expect under 7Q10 conditions. Do you have any sense of, or does anyone listening have any sense of what the DO would get to if we actually had a 7Q10 flow rate in the Mississippi River, like maybe we had in the Dust Bowls of the 30s and 40s?
This is Ida. I can tell you that it was about 3 or 2 before in 1988, before the point sources, phosphorus from the point sources were controlled. I do not know what it would be at the 7Q10 nowadays.
This is Dennis. I think it would be a lot better than 1988 because the point sources were really high in 88 and they'd be a lot lower. I mean, like Lee said, it's as Ida and I were working on this, each flow is really different. And I think in 7Q10 flows, the transport from like Mankato, like Lee said, we have this system all the way up from Granite Falls of this algae that keeps coming down and you keep adding phosphorus and they keep transporting. The real problem is that we have this huge load of algae at Jordan. I think if you went to 7Q10 conditions, those algae would not transport near as well in the river as they did in like 2012 and 2021. There you have enough current that keeps moving the algae along. So you have this huge amount of algae coming into the metro reach. 2012, there was enough flow that it couldn't stay in that dredged reach long enough to cause low DO. And then in 2021, it actually lingered long enough that you could get low DO. And I think in 88 flows, I think we'd have to trust the model that that's when the point source really matters. I mean, that's when you don't get any rain anywhere in the basin for like a month, and it's just groundwater and point sources, and you'd have a lot more transport losses. So that's what I would expect. But until we get it, it's hard to say.
And to Lee and Ski, yeah, the 7Q10 are updated regularly, which means every 10 years or so we update them, but they do not change all that much even in 10 years. But I can say that the value for the 7Q10 that was computed for 1988 was about 270 or so. And when I recomputed it maybe 10 years ago or maybe 5 years ago, it was about 298. I mean, for summer.
Are there any other questions for Lee, or I guess anyone, as we were having a great little discussion here this morning with
So this is
everybody who's got
Marco.
this expertise.
This is Marco, and it's not a question as much as maybe food for thought. We're getting to the point where this is not a phosphorus loading problem, but it is a dredging problem. If the reaches that are no longer dredged are no longer impaired, and is continuing to reduce phosphorus the solution for this particular problem, this DO problem in the lower soda, or are they is it necessary to continue to have what is it, a 12-foot channel? It's either 8 or 12, I'm not sure. How much is it used, and could something different be done? Food for thought.
So there are two things about the phosphorus. One of them, I think that probably Denise can answer that better, but I think at this point too is that the phosphorus not only stays when the Minnesota ends, it travels down to the Lake Pepin, so it is an issue downstream.
I would just add, I think you have some merit there, Marco. I think it's a very unique thing in a river system, and I don't know if we looked elsewhere. If you have a lot of algae coming in to an environment that's not conducive for algal growth, maybe we could find a situation in other rivers or maybe reservoirs or something. But the big thing to me is for river eutrophication standards, we're still way over, and we need to make huge non-point reductions that would help during some of these, not 7Q10 flows, but like low flows. Like those are like the drought of all low flows, but these intermediate low flows, we really need to reduce non-point phosphorus. We've already reduced phosphorus beyond the low DO targets for the draft river eutrophication TMDL that we're working on had lower allocations for the point sources. So we have continued to reduce those, but the non-point source phosphorus would help throughout all the impairments, the blue earth, all the segments that Lee mentioned. So I think we probably don't need any more phosphorus reduction from point sources, and the dredging, if they quit doing it, that probably would help. But we still need a lot of reductions both for Lake Pepin and all the rivers in the Minnesota River would help tremendously to meet river eutrophication standards.
Well, if there are not any additional comments or questions or things you all feel might be a good conversation to continue, I think we could close a little early. But if there are any more questions or comments, it's your last chance to get them
So
in.
this is Saida again about the dissolved oxygen. Probably, as Lee was mentioning, in the surface where there is where the water interfaces with the atmosphere, there may be a little bit more oxygen than right below, like maybe when 4 inches below. But I guess it is in the whole water column you do not see that much difference. That was my point. Sorry.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for the great conversation, and thank you to Lee for your time and preparing and being with us this morning to share your work with all of us and to initiate this great conversation. I think with that, we will go ahead and close today's session. And we look forward to seeing you all on, let me pull up my thing, in 2 weeks. What do we have on the schedule? It looks like on the 27th, we have no seminar because we have the Water and Watersheds conference. So we'll probably all still see each other, just at a different venue. And then on February 10th, we will have Jane D. Lambert from Department of Health to talk about the MDH source water CEC study. So we hope to see all of you on February 10th. And of course, if you guys have any great, research that you're aware of that you think would be great to have at one of our upcoming water issues seminars, please let us know. Or if you have some work you want to share with all of us, please reach out to myself, Katie, or Mark, and we'll be happy to fit you into the schedule. So I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.